Hello, I'm David Boyer, Danfoss Service Training Coordinator. I'm going to demonstrate how to use the logging feature in the MCT10 software. The main idea with the logging function is that a drive can be configured to capture and store data within itself to be retrieved at a later time.
Please take a moment now to pause the video to read the safety warnings shown here. Failure to follow these warnings could result in death or serious injury.
There are significant differences between scoping and logging. Let's go through those. Is it available in the free version? Scoping, yes. There is a limited version of the scope function. In the free version, it's limited to 2 channels. Logging, this requires the full licensed version of MCT10. Can you put up the same channel more than once? No, in scoping you cannot. And there'd be no point because it would be exactly the same all times. But in the logging, you can look at the same channel a number of times. The reason that you might want to do that is on this next line here, the next 2 lines, polling rate and buffers. When scoping, the fastest sample rate is 200 milliseconds. That'd be 5 samples per second. And whatever you choose applies to all channels. In the full version, you can scope up to 8 channels at a time. In the logging feature, it's much quicker. You can sample at 5 millisamples per second or 200 samples per second, and they're individually selectable. You select the sample rate for each channel. The reason that the logging feature can sample much more quickly is because it doesn't need to communicate that information across the serial port the way it is when you're scoping. PC has to poll the drive for that information across the RS-485 serial connection. Here it's storing straight into its own buffer, so you can get much higher resolution. And then the buffers, of course, when you're scoping, the buffer, all the information is being stored on your PC. The buffer size is adjustable and up to a maximum of 125,000 samples per channel. When logging, the buffer is right inside the drive. There's a memory chip on the drive where this information is being stored, and it's fixed at 2,000 samples and shared equally among however many channels you choose. If you're just looking at one channel, that's 2,000 samples. And of course, at the fastest polling rate of 200 samples per second, that'd be just 10 seconds worth of information at the fastest rate. If you're looking at 2 channels, the buffer for each channel would be 1,000 samples, which would, of course, just be 5 seconds, and then so on. If you do 4 channels, that's just 2.5 seconds worth of information when polling at the fastest rate. There are some differences with triggering. When you're scoping, you've got the full list of all of the parameter set, the 16 group, the data readouts. You can choose anything on that list, and you can select to trigger either on a rising edge or falling edge. When you're logging, if you want to look at some of those analog values, for example, motor frequency or motor current, motor voltage, DC link voltage, those aren't available directly. You would need to configure a comparator, and you can only trigger on the rising edge, no falling edge. There's a clever way around that I'll show you later. Can you configure via the LCP keypad? No, in scoping. But logging, yes, you can. You can go up to a drive working right from the keypad, configure this logging function with no PC involved at all, no MCT10 software required, and then you can later come back and view what's been stored in that buffer. I'm going to start with a very simple example, the sequence that I would recommend you use when retrieving information out of your drive that's been saved in the log buffer. First, you can go right to the keypad of the drive and configure the logging function. It's parameter group 15-1. Then wait for whatever trigger condition you've selected, make that happen. And then later come by and plug in your PC, open up your MCT 10 software. The first step that I would recommend doing before opening up your logging scope is look at that 15-1 group of parameters and note them, jot them down. Then you add the new scope folder. You're choosing Drive Real-Time Channel. It's going to bring up a dialog box asking, do you want to read what's in the drive right now? I recommend that you choose no. These values that you read looking at that parameter group, make sure your scope matches that, and then acquire the data. So let's see how this looks. What I have here is a keypad, a virtual keypad plugged into a live drive. This looks and acts exactly the way a keypad would look and act if you went up to a drive to configure this. This is to show that you can configure this feature without needing a PC with you at the time. It's showing drive initialized alarm 80, proving that we're starting with a clean slate. So let's clear that alarm. We'll go into the main menu and get to that parameter group 15-1. 15-1, hit OK. Logging source. We'll start with a very simple example. This is an array parameter. There are 4 channels. The first channel is index 0. If you want to get to the other channels, you change that to a 1. Third channel would be 2. Fourth channel would be 3. We're just going to configure one channel. Hit OK to make that active. And we'll look at analog input 53. Hit OK. Back out of this parameter and go to the next one, which is that logging interval or polling rate. By default, it is at the fastest possible, 5 milliseconds per sample. And we'll just leave that there. The trigger event, I'm going to trigger an analog input 33. I'm setting up this way just because it'll be real easy to show an example. I'm going to put that analog input in the display. I'm going to put the digital inputs in the display so we can see what's going on. So we're going to trigger on digital input 33, logging mode. The way to make the drive capture and hang on to that first trigger event information is to choose log once on trigger. There's just 2 choices here. Log always, where information would always be streaming through the buffer, and then you would just go back and grab whatever's in it at the time. We want to log once on the trigger, get that information, and hang on to it. Samples before trigger. Remember, there's 2,000 samples total. Do you want to see what happened before the trigger event or after? By default, it's 50%, meaning it shows half the buffer before the event, half after. I'm going to change that to 70%. You'll see why in a minute here. And then let's change our display so that we can see our analog input and digital inputs. We'll put that right in the center of this display. Here we will choose analog input 53. Below that, analog input 53. Below that, in the main display, we'll choose digital inputs, number 1660. There it is, digital inputs. Now we look at our display, and I've got a potentiometer plugged into input 53 where I can easily manipulate that value. And then below that is the digital inputs. This last character, that 0, that's terminal 53. When that goes to a 1, it's going to wait for that buffer to fill, and then it's going to keep that information until we retrieve it. So I'll dial down to 0, work my way up to 10 volts, wiggle around a little, hit the trigger. You can see that becomes a 1, and dial it down just so our scope trace will have some action on it. I can turn the trigger off. So the drive here captured that information and saved it. Now let's retrieve it. You come by later, you plug in your MCT 10, plug into the drive, and there it shows up. Like I said, I would first recommend looking at the drive to see how that log is configured. That's your 15-1 group, data log settings. We can see here we're looking at analog input 53. We're pulling at 5 milliseconds per sample. We're going to trigger on digital input 33, trigger once, save that log. We want to see 70% of the buffer before the trigger. So now you pull up a new scope file. Once you highlight it, you get a dialog box where it wants to know what drive are you interested in getting information from. And here's where you choose the logging feature. PC polling is the scope function. Your PC is polling the drive for information. Real time is we're going to look at what has been saved in the drive. Here's that dialog box I mentioned where it says, do you want to read the current real-time log from the drive? I would recommend saying no. The reason is if you choose yes here, it will retrieve that information, but it doesn't capture all of the settings. If you choose no, you can look at your settings. There's our analog input 53. There's our sample rate, our trigger, log once, and 70%. So when you hit OK here, your scope is configured and you use start data acquisition. That's how you acquire what was in the drive. There are three choices here. While plugged into the drive, you can wait for that trigger event and then it'll pop up that information. If you're configuring your drive using MCT10, you make this choice, just configure the log in the real-time drive, where you can make your settings here, highlight that, hit OK, and it'll write those settings to the drive. Get the real-time log currently on the drive. That's what we want to do. And so when we hit OK there, we can see I'm going to go into properties and change the seconds per division so we can see the whole. I'll go 3 seconds per division. So here's the trigger event. That is when I activated input 33, which it's using as its trigger. And it shows I dialed that up to 10, hit the trigger, then brought it back down, and it saved that information. Now, having retrieved this, the buffer in the drive is now empty. And that's one reason why I recommended going through and choosing no, so you can look at your settings, make sure they're all correct, because choosing yes, it does not always reliably read from the drive the trigger condition, the trigger mode, or the samples before or after the trigger. I'm going to go into properties here. I'll put up a cursor. I'll use the delta X so that we can get measure time. Turn those cursors on. And remember, we said logging at 5 milliseconds per channel on one channel. It's 10 seconds worth of information. And it should be, we said 70% before the trigger. So after the trigger, we've got 3 seconds. And then, of course, before the trigger, we'd have 7. Now let's just look at properties here. And, yep, everything's good. Everything's correct. Now, once your scope is configured correctly, as in matching the drive, we can go back here, acquire data, wait for the trigger event. So now this will be acting somewhat like the scope function. The advantage is, remember that you can trigger or you can take samples 40 times faster every 5 milliseconds as opposed to 200. So here's how this looks. It's waiting for the buffer to be full, and the buffer is not going to be full until the trigger event, which is terminal 33. So Let's just dial up our analog input 53, go to 7 volts, down to 3, up to 7, hit the trigger, and we'll just dial it down to 0. So it took a while after the trigger for this to pop up because it was still collecting data for 3 seconds after the trigger. Now, let's change some settings. How about we're only interested in what happens before the trigger event? We want 100% of the buffer before the trigger. So if we hit OK there, I'm going to show you that just changing that did not change that setting in the drive. In order to change that setting in the drive, you need to hit your acquire data again. Just configure the real-time log on the drive. So hitting OK there. Now if we go back and look, that's when it wrote that change to the drive. That's now 100%. So 100% of the sample, turn my trigger off, acquire data again, wait for the trigger event. All right, it's waiting for the trigger event. It's waiting for me to hit that. So let's just dial our input up and down. Once we hit the trigger, see it instantly popped up because it just showed me what was in the buffer at the time I hit the trigger. On the other hand, if I choose 0% before the trigger and then write that setting to the drive and acquire data, wait for the trigger, turn the trigger off, put the trigger back off again, say OK, waiting for the trigger event. And now when I hit the trigger and I turn on my input 33, it's going to take 10 seconds now because I've said give me 10 seconds worth of data after the trigger. And there it is. There's the trigger. And there's 10 seconds of what happened after the trigger. Okay, let's make it a little more interesting. This will demonstrate a couple things. One, remember I said you can look at the same channel more than once. Let's just do that. We'll look at analog input 53 4 times. And we'll use different polling rates. 10 seconds, so that'll be half as fast. 15 milliseconds, I should say. And 20. Let's look at everything before the trigger, nothing after. Hit OK. Remember, you need to write those settings to the drive using just configure real-time drive log on the drive. We can confirm that, yes, that was written to the drive. Terminal 53 4 times, 5, 10, 15, 20, log once, and 100% of the samples before the trigger. Back to our scope. Turn the trigger event off again. Separate these just a little bit. That'd be appearance. What's the base position? We'll make this 0, -3, -6, and -9, just so that these traces aren't all right on top of one another. Might as well make them the same units per division, right? And hit OK. So now when we say wait for the trigger, I'll dial that analog input up and down. So the slowest sampling rate was every 20 milliseconds, 4 times slower. And look what we get. Put up our cursors again. That first channel, the red one, 5 milliseconds, that should be 2.5 seconds. The green one should be twice as long because it's pulling at half the rate, and it is 5 seconds. 7.5 seconds. And the slowest one took 10 seconds to fill that buffer. So you can trigger on an event here, get good resolution, and then by changing those sampling rates, you can get a long trend over time. 13 years in tech support, occasionally the caller would say, my drive goes through the same process, same cycle all day, day after day. Sometimes it trips on, say, a DC link voltage, and most of the time it does not. Why does that happen? Well, it may be that always at that particular part of the cycle, it's close to tripping, but just doesn't. Using this and various rates, you can go back further and further in time to see a trend, and confirm that idea. Is that what's happening? Is it always close to the alarm threshold, but not just over? Sampling at the fastest rate of the scope function, 200 milliseconds per sample. That's 40 times as long. If you did just one channel, that's about 6.5 minutes. Or you could take a sample every second or every minute, and get a trend over time. You could come in every morning and retrieve a trend as to what speed your drive's been going all night long. Let's look at what happens rather than look at everything before the trigger. Let's look at nothing before the trigger. Look at everything after. So write that change to the drive. Turn off my trigger event. Choose acquire data. Wait for the trigger. Hit OK. And now, once the trigger occurs, it's going to begin collecting data. And I'll show you something interesting that happens here. I'll hit the trigger event. It's going to wait for the buffers to fill up. So this first fastest channel, it hit the trigger, and then it started collecting data. Now, once that finished, even though there was still room in these buffers, it stops. It bases buffer full being on the first buffer that's full. So once this channel's buffer is full, it stops taking information for all channels. Now, it figured I'll go ahead and show you what I had in the buffer prior to that, since that information is there, but it stopped once that first buffer filled. I mentioned that you can't choose falling edge for a trigger condition directly, but what I've got going on here is a program that I wrote that essentially allows you to do that using the smart logic. I'll show you here that I programmed terminal 29 as a digital output set for smart logic controller output A. And then let's look at the smart logic settings. Smart logic controller mode is on. The start event is true. The stop event is false, meaning that it's always running through the sequence of event action pairs. And then how does that look? The first event is comparator 0, which I programmed for analog input 53 being greater than 50% or 5 volts. What action do you take when that event occurs? No action. It's essentially a gatekeeper to get to this next step in the sequence, which is comparator 1. Comparator 1 is analog input 53 less than 45% or 4.5 volts. So you get above 5 volts, you get to here, you start looking for when you get below 4.5. When that happens, set that digital output A high, and remember that'll activate terminal 29. So when 29 activates, start a timer. The timer is set for 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds. When that times out, go ahead and set that A low again. So I have in my display the digital outputs. I still have terminal 53 here. So once I dial that above 5 volts, it gets to that second step of the sequence where it's looking for it to go less than 4.5. These are the digital outputs. This character represents terminal 29. So when I go below 4.5 volts, that should activate for a second, which it does. And then I've got the scope all set up here where, again, we're looking at that terminal 53 4 times at various sample rates. Notice that last one is pretty slow. And then we're triggering on digital output 29. Show us 100% of the information before the trigger. So let's dial this down low. Acquire data. Wait for that trigger. Hit OK. It's waiting for that to become a 1, which will become a 1 when we go above 5 volts and then below 4.5. Dial it up above 5. Go way up above 5. And then down below 4.5. That became a 1 for a moment, and it captured the information. Let's get a bigger picture here. And we were capturing 100% before the trigger. There's the trigger. There's the various sampling rates of what happened before. So just a tricky way around the fact that you can't directly choose falling edge. Now, we could go in here and make our trigger event comparator 0. Remember, that's analog input 53 above 5 volts. Hit OK. Write that to the drive. Acquire data. Wait for the trigger. It's going to trigger as soon as I get above 5. And it did. Same way you can, this is what you'd need to do if you're wanting to trigger on motor current, motor voltage, output frequency, things like that. You need to set up these comparators. So that just look at comparator 1. Remember, that's this being below 4.5. Did I write that to the drive? Acquire data. Waiting for the trigger being this below 4.5. We go below 4.5, and it captured. Now, let's say you capture something interesting, which this isn't particularly, but if you do, I would recommend saving that file. Let's just rename it. Save this. And remember, too, just like the scope, if you right-click, you can choose New Text Note, where you can record, job site, conditions, etc. And it'll always save that along with that scope folder. And say you want to continue. Remember, you can copy, paste. Here it is. Maybe, call it whatever you want. Next trial. And when you open that, it's got all your same settings. Just a good way to, hang on to that, leave it alone, don't ever go back there, and you'll have it saved forever. Well, that covers MCT10 logging. I hope you've found it useful and you're getting some ideas on how you can use this for troubleshooting and perhaps commissioning. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for viewing. We hope this information has been helpful. Danfoss drives can provide additional technical support, parts information, or repair services options by contacting us through one of the following methods. For immediate access to customer service or a technical support expert in North America, call 1-888-DANFOSS or 1-888-326-3677 or contact us through email. For technical support, the email address is drives.ts.na@danfoss.com. For customer service, the email address is drives.cs.na@danfoss.com. For after-sales service, the email address is drives.ts sales.service.na@danfoss.com. Additional information is also available on our website at www.danfossdrives.com. For contact information in areas outside of North America, please visit our global website at www.danfoss.com. Thanks again.